Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Identity Talks, and I'm so excited about this conversation today. We're joined by SailPoint's Chief Product Officer, Paul Truelove. Paul, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I have a few questions for you. We're going to be talking about cloud governance, and really let's start with kind of the basics. Why is governing access to cloud platforms becoming such an important area of focus for identity management teams?
Yeah, it's a great question. The reality is, as more and more companies move more and more of their assets out into the cloud from an IT perspective, so whether it's compute environments, storage environments, those kinds of things, they should ultimately be applying the same basic identity controls to those assets the same way that they've done, for a long time to their data center resources as well. The unfortunate reality is many organizations haven't actually extended their identity program in this area. And so, what has resulted is all of those new applications and other cloud workloads that are sitting out there in identity, or not identity, but infrastructure as a service platforms like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud are relatively unprotected from an identity and access management perspective relative to their on-prem assets. And so what we're finding is more and more organizations are coming around to this realization that governing access to their cloud platforms is just as critical, and in some cases even more critical, especially as they put not only sensitive data, but highly regulated data out into these large cloud platforms.
Interesting. So would you say that it's more challenging? And if it is, what makes it more challenging than, say, governing access to traditional on-premises applications?
Sure. Yeah, I would argue that in a lot of ways it is more challenging. First and foremost, in some ways the stakes are higher. So a lot of organizations, including some that I've talked to just as recent as the last few weeks, still use their network as a backstop to identity and access management processes. So, if I terminate a user and I cut their network access, they can't actually get access to applications that I'm running, in my data center. If I'm doing a good job, with a basic network perimeter, I can probably keep the bad guys out of my on-prem resources. The problem is, as you move out to the cloud, then that network perimeter goes away for all intents and purposes. So, if you have a poor identity governance approach to your cloud resources, you're really putting your organization at significant risk of breach. And honestly, we've seen some of these pop up recently. We've talked about different Amazon S3 buckets that have been open to the internet that house some relatively important data. The other thing that makes it more challenging is that non-human access is a much bigger part of the way that a cloud application is architected. So you tend to have a lot of machine-to-machine accounts. That access is very pervasive. And ultimately, as we know, if you're not governing all of your access, you're creating holes that ultimately can be used for malicious purposes. So it's not just about knowing who has access, but you also have to know about what has access. And the reality, most identity management platforms, especially the legacy ones, just don't do a good job in that area of visibility and control over cloud resources.
Interesting. So then I guess let's bring this full circle. How does identity governance solutions in particular, how do those help, not just, from some of these points that you've already made, but security, efficiency, like what are all the things that identity governance does?
Honestly, it's very similar to what we've been talking about for the past decade or so, as it relates to just good identity governance. So you should know who has access to what in those systems, but also what has access to what. You've got to apply good security and compliance controls to make sure that the right users, your humans and your non-human, actually have the access that they need and only what they need. But you also need to look at how that access is being used on a day-to-day basis and make sure that the access is actually being used in an appropriate way. The challenge is that all of these things at the scale of cloud are very complex. So the number of identities, especially the machine identities, the number of entitlements and different policies, the dynamic nature of that access makes this a much more challenging problem to solve. And this is really where SailPoint's new cloud governance solutions allow us to leverage some key technologies, AI, machine learning, that go in and quickly assess the state of identity governance in these cloud platforms, and then ultimately allow us to begin to put the same types of identity controls in place that you would have in a traditional on-premises application and infrastructure environment.
Wow, that's a lot to think about, but everybody's head's kind of in the clouds these days. So that's great information. And we look forward to hearing more on this from you soon. And thank you so much for joining us today.